Today, much of society fears the idea of solitude. However, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer dedicated his life to understanding, among other things, the relationship of individuals with isolation from a deep existential point of view. If we unfold his thoughts, we find that Schopenhauer divided solitude into three distinct instances. Chosen solitude starts with a fundamental premise. The person does not isolate themselves because they cannot relate to others, but because they understand that their inner life has value that does not depend on the constant presence of others. Here, Schopenhauer provides a key insight. The richer the mind, the less it needs external stimuli to feel complete. In this type of solitude, there is no escape or rejection. There is selection. The person allows themselves to be alone because they find clarity in that space that social noise often dilutes. They do not stop valuing others, but they carefully measure which relationships truly nurture their mental stability. On the other hand, imposed solitude arises when isolation is not a choice but a consequence. Abandonment, rejection, marginalization, work schedules that prevent deep connections, or emotional circumstances that make it difficult to open up to others. This solitude weighs heavily. It is not silent but noisy from within. It does not allow serenity to be built because it arises from lack, not from fullness. While chosen solitude is defined by autonomy, imposed solitude is defined by scarcity. It may be mistaken for strength. I'm fine alone, but often it conceals fear of emotional exposure, accumulated insecurities, or wounds that inhibit trust. Finally, strategic withdrawal constitutes a third, more subtle category. It is not exactly pure choice nor absolute imposition. It is a conscious move inward to regain balance. It occurs when a person identifies that their environment is saturated, that their energy is scattered, or that their relationships are tainted with conflict, expectations, or pressures. They then withdraw, not to live isolated, but to recalibrate their mind before re-engaging. Here, solitude acts as a cognitive and emotional rest. It is a deliberate break, a hygienic pause. While chosen solitude reflects deep autonomy, and imposed solitude expresses a fracture, strategic withdrawal operates as a tool. It does not seek to live without others, but to coexist better after a necessary retreat. In this nuance, the intelligence of temporary isolation as a psychological preservation mechanism becomes evident. For Schopenhauer, will is a blind, irrational, and universal force that drives all existence. It does not think, plan, or need justification. It simply pushes. When this idea is transferred to the collective human realm, what we can call the will of the masses appears, the sum of impulses, desires, and fears that, when unified, acquire a power greater than any individual's. It is not a conscious or organized will, but a psychological movement that pulls. In a crowd, people do not necessarily think more, they only feel at the same time. This collective will acts on the individual, eroding their own judgment. The subject, who in solitude can reason clearly, within a group becomes more susceptible to foreign emotions, imitations, and dominant trends. Schopenhauer argued that most people do not seek truth but approval, and the masses provide precisely a space where critical thinking weakens and conformity becomes comfortable. The individual, in order not to be left out, adjusts their behavior to what the collective desires, even if they do not fully understand that desire themselves. The will of the masses also amplifies impulses that would normally be moderated. Indignation becomes fury, excitement becomes fanaticism, sympathy becomes idolatry. The individual becomes subordinated to an emotional rhythm they cannot control. For this reason, for Schopenhauer, true mental independence requires distancing oneself from the crowd. Only outside the collective influence can clarity and authenticity be regained, which the mass, without ill intentions but with enormous power, tends to blur. This can be seen concretely in the idea of normative conformity, demonstrated by Solomon Asch, which shows how people adjust their behavior to avoid social rejection, even when they know the group is wrong. In his experiments, individuals perfectly capable of identifying the correct line would alter their response to avoid clashing with the majority. This mechanism operates on an emotional level. The fear of disapproval outweighs the evidence. The person feels that going against threatens their belonging, and this threat activates enough social anxiety to cloud cognitive clarity. Informational conformity, on the other hand, arises when the individual assumes others possess superior information. Here, the driving force is not the desire to fit in, but the feeling of incompetence in the face of uncertainty. When a situation seems ambiguous, the group is observed as a reference, and personal judgment is relegated. This mechanism is especially strong in new contexts, crisis situations, or environments with perceived authority. The person internalizes the idea that they must know more than I do, and ends up adopting beliefs or decisions that are not truly their own. The bystander effect adds another level. It suggests that the more people present during an emergency, the less likely it is that someone will intervene. Responsibility becomes diluted. Each individual implicitly assumes that someone else will act first, or that if no one acts, perhaps the situation isn't that serious. This disconnection between perception and action reduces personal initiative and reveals how the presence of others can paralyze basic responses. In small groups, these mechanisms become more subtly intensified. Interpersonal closeness creates pressure to maintain harmony, and the desire to avoid conflict can lead to self-censorship. The individual begins to filter their thoughts before expressing them, anticipating others' reactions. Over time, this self-censorship becomes a habit, and cognitive autonomy is eroded. One thinks less based on personal criteria and more based on what the group will tolerate. The result is a progressive emptiness of the inner voice, replaced by a version adjusted to what is socially acceptable within that small circle. In fact, the effects of the group on intellect are measurable and consistent in various psychological studies. The first is the reduction of critical thinking. When a person integrates into a stable group, they tend to evaluate information less by themselves and rely more on what the majority already considers valid. This decline happens because the cognitive system prioritizes social security over logical accuracy. Disagreeing can create friction, while aligning avoids conflicts. The brain, automatically, dampens internal doubts to maintain the cohesion of the environment. Thus, ideas that would be questioned in solitude pass without deep analysis in a group. The inhibition of contradictory ideas is a second clear effect. In a group dynamic, especially if there is strong leadership or implicit norms, people self-censor before expressing thoughts that challenge the dominant narrative. They do not do it out of lack of ideas, but out of emotional anticipation. They fear sanctions, discomfort, or being in the minority position. Over time, this inhibition not only affects expression, but also the generation of ideas. The individual stops thinking of alternatives because they know they will not be well received. The mind begins to operate within a narrow and predictable framework shaped by the group's expectations. On the other hand, over-adaptation to social norms constitutes a third mechanism. When belonging becomes important, the person adjusts their behavior beyond what is reasonable to avoid standing out. They modify their way of speaking, their tastes, their political or cultural opinions, even their emotional style. This continuous adaptation creates cognitive wear and diminishes intellectual spontaneity. Mental energy is invested in maintaining coherence with the group, not in exploring new ideas. Automatic emotional imitation completes the picture. Emotions spread quickly. If the group becomes outraged, the person feels indignation. If they become excited, enthusiasm arises. This contagion shifts the rational evaluation of facts. The individual reacts as part of a collective organism, and their perception aligns without prior reflection. In this state, the ability to think with critical distance is further reduced because the foreign emotion replaces their own. The sum of these effects constitutes a gradual loss of intellectual independence, almost always unnoticed until the contrast of solitude is experienced. According to these philosophical principles, a superior mind detects these mechanisms more quickly because it is trained, consciously or intuitively, to observe patterns before becoming trapped in them. While most react to the social environment by adapting without questioning it, the intellectually sharper individual notices the small internal shifts. How their thinking becomes less sharp, how certain ideas stop being expressed for fear of causing discomfort, how collective emotion begins to influence their judgment. This sensitivity to the loss of autonomy acts as an alarm signal. It is not misanthropy or fragility. It is an early perception that something external is beginning to shape their judgment. Another key reason is the relationship these individuals maintain with their own thinking. For a superior mind, internal clarity is not optional. It is the core from which they interpret the world. When a group explicitly pressures someone to adopt shared beliefs, emotional tones, or behaviors, the intellectually capable individual notices the tension between their reasoning and the majority's current mindset. That dissonance is not experienced as a mere disagreement, but as a real risk of cognitive contamination. Instead of insisting on convincing or fitting in, they choose to preserve their judgment by retreating to a space where their ideas can develop without interference. The speed with which they detect these dynamics also comes from a deeper self-awareness. This type of person recognizes when conformity begins to act, when their judgment softens to avoid rejection, when the group's emotion threatens to replace their own rational evaluation. While others may take months or years to notice that they have lost their inner voice, the superior mind notices it in hours or days, and instead of resisting from within, they distance themselves to regain perspective. Therefore, their isolation does not come from social incapacity. They do not withdraw because they cannot coexist with others, but because they understand the invisible cost of doing so without filters. Voluntary solitude in this context is a preservation mechanism, a way to maintain intact the independence of thought that the group, even without ill intention, tends to erode. In that personal space, the mind listens to itself again, recalibrates, and strengthens itself before deciding whether to re-engage or stay on the sidelines. When we isolate individuals from global or group dynamics, we find that their individuality is composed, or at least differentiated, into two parts. Authentic individuality is built from within. It arises from personal reflection, awareness of one's own limits, talents, desires, and principles. It is a slow and sometimes uncomfortable process because it forces one to confront internal contradictions and take responsibility for what one thinks and is. Philosophically, this individuality represents coherence between the inner life and external behavior. It does not depend on the approval of the environment. It is sustained by conviction. In Schopenhauerian terms, it is the space where the person listens to their own will and acts in accordance with it. The borrowed identity of the group works in the opposite way. It does not arise from introspection, but from imitation and the absorption of external norms, emotions, and beliefs. It is a comfortable identity because it reduces the tension of decision-making. The individual adopts already packaged opinions, already validated emotions, and already accepted behaviors. Here, the person recognizes themselves less by what they are and more by where they belong. Their sense of self becomes a reflection, not an internal construction. This identity, although stable in appearance, is fragile. If the group changes, the person changes with it. If the group disappears, the identity crumbles. The essential philosophical difference lies in the source of authenticity. Authentic individuality requires deliberation, self-knowledge, and the ability to sustain principles even in solitude. Borrowed identity requires only presence. Simply being in a group is enough to receive a predefined emotional and intellectual template. One builds inner freedom, the other dilutes autonomy until it becomes an echo of the environment. The inner world, the creative source that only emerges in deep silence. That is why, within this philosophical doctrine, there is a phrase that, although it may sound like a cliché, has a deep meaning. Being alone without feeling lonely describes a state in which the physical absence of others does not create emotional emptiness, because the person possesses an internal support that is sufficiently solid. To understand this precisely, it is useful to distinguish between two phenomena that are often confused: emotional isolation and psychological self-sufficiency. This idea, simple but powerful, differentiates the loneliness imposed by society, by exclusion, from the desired solitude, the individual's quest to define themselves in a personal space delimited by their own will. Emotional isolation is an affective disconnection, not an external situation. It can occur surrounded by friends, in a relationship, or within a large family. The individual feels that they cannot express their inner world, that their emotions do not find resonance or understanding. It is not the lack of company that hurts, but the feeling of ineptitude to connect authentically. Emotional isolation leaves an echo of constant lack. The person seeks approval, fears rejection, and perceives that their identity needs to be confirmed by others. The silence of solitude is experienced as abandonment, and any withdrawal is interpreted as loss. There is a latent vulnerability because well-being depends on external contact. Psychological self-sufficiency, on the other hand, is precisely the opposite. It does not mean closing the door to the world or rejecting company. It means having developed an internal axis that supports emotions, decisions, and thoughts without the need for constant reinforcement. A psychologically self-sufficient person understands their own needs and limits, has a clear inner dialogue, and does not feel threatened by silence. Solitude, in this case, is not punishment or emptiness, but a space that does not take away anything essential. There may be affection, connections, and sociability, but the inner life does not collapse when these are temporarily absent. The key difference lies in the source of stability. In emotional isolation, stability is external. It depends on access to others. In psychological self-sufficiency, stability is internal. The individual sustains their own emotional narrative. That is why someone self-sufficient can be physically alone and still feel accompanied by their own thoughts, their story, and their inner clarity. From this perspective, the concept of being alone without feeling lonely means that the presence of others is valued, but not indispensable for existing fully. The person does not seek company to fill gaps, but to share from abundance. They do not cling to others to avoid emotional drowning. They choose relationships because they enjoy them, not because they depend on them. In this state, solitude is not a threat, but a form of serene freedom that strengthens the identity rather than wearing it down. Understanding this allows us to cultivate the inner world, an idea that invites us to create a fertile mental space where ideas can grow without being immediately swept away by external stimuli. It is not an isolated act, but a set of habits that strengthen intellectual and emotional life. One of these is rigorous philosophical reading. Reading philosophy does not mean memorizing quotes or adopting abstract stances, but engaging with authors who compel precise thinking. Rigorous reading exposes the reader to complex arguments, logical structures, and fundamental questions. It forces one to abandon superficiality and train attention. Schopenhauer, Spinoza, or Simone Weil are not read quickly, they are dissected. That effort is exercise for the cognitive muscles. Deep conceptual analysis continues this training. It consists of not settling for the first impression of an idea, but examining its premises, consequences, and limits. It is about asking, what exactly does this concept mean? Under what conditions is it valid? What contradictions does it contain? What alternatives exist? This type of analysis allows thought to stop being reactive and become deliberate. A mind that analyzes concepts with this depth acquires precision and avoids emotional contagion and the confusion typical of superficial opinion. This reflective inner dialogue is another central component. It is not about ruminating on problems, but about holding authentic conversations with oneself, exploring doubts, reviewing decisions, contrasting emotions with facts, and organizing priorities. This dialogue creates inner continuity and prevents the identity from depending solely on external stimuli. It allows one to discover real motivations and dismantle personal illusions. Aesthetic contemplation expands this inner world from another angle. Listening to music with full attention, observing art without haste, or walking in nature enhances sensitivity and sharpens perception. The aesthetic does not only generate pleasure, it educates the eye and ear to capture nuances. Beauty orders the mind, grants it rhythm and depth, balancing analytical thinking with a broader, more human dimension. Finally, the ability to sustain a prolonged line of thought is the core of all inner cultivation. It requires discipline to keep attention focused on the same problem, idea, or reading without dispersing. In a world saturated with interruptions, this ability is almost a superpower. It allows one to reach conclusions that only emerge after long hours of silent concentration. Cultivating the inner world allows for enriching the mind, a key concept in this philosophical doctrine. A rich inner mind is characterized by generating its own content, ideas, associations, questions, interpretations, and connections that do not depend on the constant influx of external stimuli. It functions as a self-sustaining system. It can spend long periods in silence without feeling empty, because its cognitive activity does not shut down when the environment calms. It reads, reflects, organizes concepts, imagines possibilities, and reviews its own convictions. This mind finds pleasure in exploring abstract structures, solving internal problems, and delving into complex emotions. Its stability is not altered by the absence of stimuli. On the contrary, silence enhances its functioning. The mind dependent on external stimuli operates in the opposite way. It needs a constant flow of novelty, such as mobile notifications, conversations, entertainment, or social validation, to feel alive or motivated. Its thinking is reactive. It responds to what happens outside, but rarely generates anything from within. When external noise is absent, restlessness or boredom arises because there is no inner framework capable of sustaining attention or interest. This mind consumes stimuli like fuel, and when that fuel runs out, its cognitive activity drastically reduces. The objective contrast lies in the source of mental energy. In the rich mind, the energy comes from within, from one's own thoughts, curiosity, imagination, and reflection. In the dependent mind, the energy comes from the outside, from social movement, approval, and constant distraction. One can be alone and continue growing, the other collapses when the environment stops nurturing it. Therefore, the rich inner mind maintains continuity and depth, while the dependent mind lives fragmented, always searching for something external to sustain it. If we analyze contemporary society without making value judgments, we can easily see that many people experience anxiety when alone, because solitude directly exposes the structure or lack of structure of their inner world. When there are no solid mental frameworks, silence becomes a disordered space where emotions, worries, and unfinished thoughts emerge without filter. The person doesn't know what to do with this internal flow because they never develop tools to organize it. Thus, solitude is not experienced as rest but as chaos, a terrain where the mind is left without guidance. The absence of deep interests exacerbates this phenomenon. When identity is primarily sustained by external stimuli such as relationships, social routines, and constant entertainment, solitude leaves the individual anchorless. There are no ideas to explore, projects to continue, curiosity to activate, or meaningful activities to structure time. This creates an immediate sense of emptiness, as if the inner world were a room without furniture. Anxiety arises because the person feels that there is nothing inside, and fears facing that perception. The inability to tolerate internal silence completes the picture. Silence is not simply the absence of sound, it is the absence of distraction. It forces one to listen to thoughts that are normally avoided through constant occupation. Many people fear this encounter because they feel that silence reveals insecurities, contradictions, unresolved desires, or emotional states they prefer to keep out of consciousness. Lacking practice in maintaining internal dialogue or processing emotions without external support, silence becomes a trigger. The Schopenhauerian doctrine provides tools to avoid this social distress, as it suggests that solitude can function as a highly precise cognitive training when the mind knows how to use it. In the absence of external stimuli, the attention system reorganizes. It stops responding to the environment and turns inward. One of the first effects is greater access to autobiographical memory. Without interruptions, the mind can revisit past events with greater coherence, reconstruct sequences, detect emotional patterns, and reinterpret experiences. This does not occur with the same depth in company because the presence of others fragments attention and activates social adaptation mechanisms. In solitude, memory becomes more continuous and detailed, allowing for a better understanding of one's own history. The consolidation of ideas is another key benefit. Many concepts that seem confusing or incomplete amidst social noise are organized when the mind enters a state of solitary concentration. Dispersed concepts begin to connect, hypotheses take shape, and intuitions transform into articulated reasoning. This consolidation occurs because solitude allows for cognitive incubation processes. The brain integrates prior information without interference, generating conclusions that are difficult to emerge in contexts saturated with interaction. On an emotional level, solitude reduces emotional contamination. By not receiving external emotional states, such as enthusiasm, irritation, or anxiety, the person can evaluate their own emotions with clarity. They do not react by contagion, but by introspection. This emotional clarity allows them to distinguish what they truly feel and which emotions come from the environment. This kind of discernment is fundamental for stable mental health and for making decisions based on one's own foundation. Intelligent minds turn solitude into a space for intellectual work because they understand that deep thinking requires continuity, internal temperature, and the absence of interruptions. In solitude, they can sustain a reflective line for minutes or hours, explore successive layers of the same idea, and allow thought to reach levels of abstraction and precision impossible in social settings. Furthermore, solitude offers structural freedom. There is no need to simplify arguments, adjust opinions to be understood, or restrain complex associations that might seem exaggerated in conversation. For an intelligent mind, solitude is not an emptiness, but a laboratory. Ideas are organized, hypotheses are tested, beliefs are questioned, emotions are examined, and possible futures are projected. Cognitive autonomy flourishes because attention no longer defends itself from external noise and is completely dedicated to building one's own thought. Thus, solitude transforms into a privileged environment where intelligence can expand without social limits or emotional interference. But to truly make the most of solitude, it is essential to differentiate between passive or superficial leisure and active or formative leisure. For Schopenhauer, not all leisure is the same. There is superficial leisure, which entertains without enriching, and formative leisure, which nourishes the inner life and strengthens the mind, though it requires active participation and effort from the individual. The distinction lies in the quality of the content with which the person fills their free time and in the effect that content has on their mental structure. Superficial leisure is passive. It seeks to anesthetize, not awaken. It includes activities that only provide momentary distraction, compulsive entertainment consumption, empty conversations, quick stimuli that fill time but leave no lasting impact. Schopenhauer observed that most people need this type of leisure because their inner world is poor. Without external distraction, they would feel emptiness or restlessness. For them, leisure functions as an escape from themselves. But this leisure does not develop any intellectual or emotional muscle. It barely postpones boredom, which will return as soon as the stimuli cease. Formative leisure, on the other hand, is active. It is not limited to passing the time, but to using it in activities that expand the mind: deep reading, self-directed study, aesthetic contemplation, writing, introspection, or philosophical reflection. For Schopenhauer, this type of leisure is the privilege of those who have a rich inner life, because they find pleasure in activities that do not depend on external excitement. Formative leisure does not anesthetize, it transforms. It allows one to develop their own judgment, strengthen concentration, expand knowledge, and refine sensitivity. Intellectual independence, original thought that emerges far from the group. While formative leisure allows us to strengthen imagination and create unique thoughts, group dynamics can inhibit this ability. In fact, the reduction of original thinking in the presence of others is a well-documented psychological phenomenon that is very easy to observe in everyday life. It happens because the social mind activates mechanisms of vigilance and self-control that, while useful for coexisting, directly interfere with creativity and intellectual authenticity. The first of these mechanisms is self-censorship. In front of others, the person filters what they think before expressing it. They discard ideas that are too risky, eliminate opinions that could cause friction, and soften any proposition that deviates from the consensus. This mental pruning not only affects what is said, it affects what is thought. Over time, the mind stops producing certain ideas because it anticipates that they will not have a safe space to be presented. The search for approval adds another layer of inhibition. Social interaction activates the need to be accepted, understood, and valued. While this need is natural, it pressures originality. The individual begins to shape their thoughts based on what they believe the environment will celebrate. Instead of thinking to understand, they think to please. The focus is no longer on truth or intellectual clarity, but on validation. Originality, which depends on internal freedom, becomes secondary to the desire to fit in. Constant social evaluation further intensifies this process. In the presence of others, the mind divides between the idea it wants to develop and the simultaneous evaluation of how that idea will be received. This monitoring reduces essential cognitive resources for deep thinking, The person observes themselves while speaking, calculates possible reactions, calibrates the tone, and adjusts every word. This mental expenditure prevents the maintenance of complex thought lines and makes it difficult to explore ideas to their fullest consequences. The attention is not on the question being investigated, but on the imagined judgment of others. As a result, the combination of self-censorship, the search for approval, and constant social evaluation produces a real impoverishment of original thinking. The mind no longer operates from freedom but from caution. The creative space narrows, spontaneity fades, and thinking becomes predictable, safe, and superficial. That is why many people find that their best ideas come in solitude. There, the mind stops defending itself and starts to create again. This is why this doctrine holds that independent thinking is not a rebellious stance or a simple preference for being different. It is a complex cognitive process that requires mental discipline and a certain emotional courage. Its first component is the ability to hold unpopular ideas. This does not mean clinging to any opposing opinion merely for the sake of contradiction, but maintaining a reasoned conviction even when it causes social discomfort. The independent mind evaluates its ideas based on their coherence and foundation, not by their external acceptance. Holding an unpopular idea means tolerating critical looks, objections, and external silence without letting that deactivate one's own reasoning. The second component is the exploration of unvalidated hypotheses. Independent thinking moves into territories where most people prefer not to enter: unanswered questions, possibilities that still lack sufficient evidence, connections that seem daring. It is not fanciful thinking, but exploratory thinking. The individual allows themselves to ask questions that are not part of the common discourse and follows conceptual threads wherever they lead, even if that means navigating intellectually uncertain areas. This openness to the untested is essential for deep creativity. Without it, thinking gets trapped in what is already accepted. Accepting intellectual uncertainty is the third piece of the process. The independent mind knows that the best ideas do not emerge fully formed and that many remain in a provisional state for a long time. It does not require the immediate certainty of a definitive answer. It understands that uncertainty is not a failure of thought, but its natural condition in advanced stages of reflection. This emotional tolerance allows one to sustain difficult questions without rushing to mediocre conclusions. For Schopenhauer, when these three elements are integrated, independent thinking becomes a process of genuine inquiry, not conditioned by external expectations. It is a form of thinking guided by curiosity, internal coherence, and personal rigor, rather than by social comfort. As in many other cases, history offers clear examples of how solitude, far from being an obstacle, can become the ideal environment for deep thinking. During the Great Plague of London between 1665 and 1666, the University of Cambridge closed its doors, and Newton, at just 22 years old, returned to his family home in Woolsthorpe. What for many was a time of fear and passivity, for him became one of the most intense creative periods in scientific history. Without teachers, colleagues, classes, or interruptions, he developed the foundations of infinitesimal calculus, formulated essential ideas for his theory of gravitation, and made advances in optics. Newton was not trying to make great discoveries. He was thinking in silence, holding complex hypotheses for weeks and letting ideas settle without external interference. His forced isolation turned into a space of cognitive freedom, where the continuity of thought, something almost impossible in university life, allowed him to articulate principles that later revolutionized physics. Charles Darwin went through a similar process, but one that was more prolonged and deliberate. After his voyage on the Beagle, he settled in Down House, where he spent decades working almost always alone, surrounded by notebooks, specimens, correspondence, and a garden he used as a natural laboratory. His private study was a closed world where he could observe without interruptions, compare patterns, organize data, and formulate hypotheses without the noise of the scientific community, which at that time viewed with suspicion any proposal that questioned the fixity of species. The theory of evolution by natural selection did not emerge from a sudden flash of insight, but from years of methodical solitude, constant analysis, and meticulous consolidation of ideas. Darwin knew that such a disruptive thought needed time, emotional distance, and freedom to mature without external pressures. His study became the only environment where he could sustain such radical questions without feeling the immediate gaze of others conditioning his process. Schopenhauer himself serves as an example to represent another type of productive solitude, the solitude chosen out of disillusionment with the academic world. Disappointed by the lack of recognition and the intellectual climate dominated by Hegel, he decided to withdraw from the university and dedicate himself to writing in isolation. This retreat was not an escape, but an assertion. Only in solitude could he develop a philosophy that did not seek to please institutions or follow intellectual trends. In that self-imposed silence, he developed The World as Will and Representation, one of the most influential philosophical works of the 19th century. Schopenhauer understood that the pressure of the academic group, with its expectations, disputes, and routines, not only distracted but could distort original thinking. His retreat was a radical defense of his own judgment. There, he found the space to delve uncompromisingly into the idea of will, human suffering, and the illusory nature of the phenomenal world. In fact, if we analyze Schopenhauer's example in depth, we can see that the group limits creativity because it introduces psychological dynamics that push people toward convergence, not originality. One of these is cascade thinking. An initial idea, even if mediocre or incorrect, becomes dominant simply because several people quickly adopt it. Each member observes the preferences of others and concludes that it must be the best option, giving up their own criteria. Creativity flattens because everyone follows the flow instead of generating alternatives. The spiral of silence deepens this effect. When someone has a different opinion, they perceive that the majority thinks the opposite and choose to remain silent to avoid social rejection. That silence reinforces the illusion of consensus, causing other dissenters to also remain silent. Slowly, minority ideas, even if valuable or innovative, disappear from the conversation. Creativity collapses because the most disruptive proposals never reach the surface. Group bias, or groupthink, completes this vicious cycle. In cohesive groups, the unconscious priority is to maintain harmony, not to produce brilliant ideas. Members avoid criticism to not break the mood, discard information that challenges the common direction, and overvalue any proposal that confirms what they already believe. Under this bias, the group becomes self-satisfied, homogeneous, and predictable. Creativity, which requires intellectual conflict, exploration, and dissent, becomes neutralized. By isolating himself from the academic world, Schopenhauer enhanced his creativity, as solitude acts as a privileged tool for creative processes that require depth and mental freedom. First, it facilitates creative incubation, that silent period in which ideas are not forced but mature underground. When the mind is not occupied responding to external stimuli or adjusting to social expectations, it can reorganize information, combine distant concepts, and allow new connections to emerge without pressure. Many genuine intuitions arise precisely when we stop actively thinking about the problem and let the brain do its work in the background. It also boosts divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple solutions or perspectives on the same issue. This type of thinking requires a space where there is no social surveillance or self-censorship that appears in groups. In solitude, the person feels free to explore unconventional, absurd, or incomplete ideas without fear of immediate judgment. That freedom opens mental pathways that would rarely be activated in company, because the group tends to reward the safe and punish the unpredictable. Solitude, by contrast, legitimizes the mental experiment. Finally, solitude allows the development of deep intuitions, those understandings that do not arise from linear reasoning, but from a slow and silent integration of experiences, perceptions, and prior knowledge. For a valid intuition to form, the mind needs enough silence to listen to its own internal patterns. In constant interaction, these patterns are drowned out by the emotional and cognitive influence of the environment. In solitude, however, the person can access more subtle levels of perception and detect coherences that were veiled by external noise. Most people base their emotional stability on shared beliefs, social norms, inherited ideas, worldviews that function as scaffolding. These frameworks provide coherence and belonging, but also limit imagination and critical thinking. Those who dare to question them often experience discomfort, existential doubt, or fear of isolation, and groups, especially institutions, often consider these individuals to have a terrifying intelligence, a concept historically feared by states, especially totalitarian ones, who have considered free thinkers as intellectual terrorists. The terrifying intelligence, in fact, can look beyond that cultural fabric without losing internal balance. It does not need consensus to validate its perception of reality. It possesses a mental structure capable of tolerating uncertainty, contradiction, and intellectual solitude. This mind does not collapse when it discovers that many collective certainties are fragile or arbitrary. On the contrary, it strengthens. The absence of a fixed framework becomes space for exploration, not for anxiety. Thinking outside cultural frameworks involves questioning dominant narratives, dismantling emotional assumptions, and considering possibilities that others dismiss as uncomfortable. It requires cognitive independence that is not acquired automatically. It is cultivated through continuous reflection, intellectual rigor, and a mature relationship with one's own vulnerability. Terrifying intelligence does not avoid questions that may destabilize. It confronts them. This ability intimidates not because it is cold or arrogant, but because it frees the individual from psychological dependence on the group. Those who think this way seem to inhabit a level of autonomy that challenges social expectations. They do not need the world to align with them to remain grounded. To others, this mental freedom appears unsettling. To the person themselves, it is simply the price and the privilege of a truly independent mind. This intellectual independence entails the ability to think for oneself, evaluate ideas without needing social approval, and hold conclusions even when they are unpopular. It requires cognitive discipline, rigor in analysis, and an honest relationship with uncertainty. The intellectually independent person does not reject others' opinions out of pride, but examines them before adopting them. Their autonomy comes from inner work, reading, reflecting, contrasting arguments, reviewing beliefs, and being willing to change when the evidence demands it. It is a deep, silent, and demanding process. Superficial individualism, on the other hand, is more of an aesthetic stance than a solid conviction. It expresses itself as a desire to be different, without a real reflective foundation. The individual distances themselves from the group, not because they have developed their own thoughts, but because they seek symbolic differentiation, rebellious opinions without analysis, automatic rejection of the common, seeking identity through visible gestures rather than solid ideas. This individualism paradoxically depends on the very group it seeks to separate from, because it needs the external gaze to validate itself as original. Attention economy, protecting mental energy to think better. But this doctrine of thought is not only based on complex abstractions or profound long-term changes, it also suggests that we have an immediate tool to change intellectually. Attention is one of the most limited resources of human beings. Although we often imagine it as something flexible and inexhaustible, in reality, it works as a system with finite capacity, very similar to mental bandwidth. Only a limited amount of information can be consciously processed at any given moment, and any additional demand competes for that space. The concept of cognitive load explains this limit. Each task, such as thinking, remembering, deciding, inhibiting impulses, or interpreting others' emotions, consumes part of that resource. When the load exceeds our capacity, mental performance declines. We become more impulsive, less precise, and more vulnerable to distractions. The mind doesn't fail due to a lack of intelligence, but due to saturation. In social contexts, where we must monitor reactions, adjust speech, interpret signals, and maintain coherence, cognitive load skyrockets. That's why deep thinking in front of others is so difficult. Mental bandwidth is another way to understand this limit. Just as an internet connection slows down when too many devices are connected, the mind becomes clumsier when too many internal tasks compete simultaneously. Worries, interruptions, emotional noise, social demands, and constant stimuli reduce the available bandwidth for complex processes, such as reasoning clearly, remembering important details, or creating new ideas. A saturated mind cannot dive deep or sustain a line of thought for long. Furthermore, attention is not only limited, it is vulnerable. Any striking stimulus, whether a message or a social gesture, can hijack it completely, displacing important tasks. This switching cost is high. Each time attention is interrupted, part of the mental thread being built is lost, and the mind must rebuild it upon returning, using even more resources. Understanding attention as a limited resource has profound implications. It means that the quality of thought depends as much on intelligence as on the management of the environment. A brilliant mind in a context of constant noise performs worse than an average mind in an orderly environment. This is why solitude and silence are not luxuries, but conditions for cognitive efficiency. They free up bandwidth, reduce unnecessary load, and allow attention to focus on what is essential. There, the mind unleashes its true capacity. On the other hand, social interaction drains mental energy because it simultaneously activates several demanding cognitive processes, even in seemingly simple conversations. The first is emotional monitoring. When interacting, we continuously adjust our tone, expressions, emotional intensity, and reactions to maintain harmony with the other person. This fine-tuning requires detecting subtle signals such as changes in voice, posture, or even microgestures, and adapting our behavior in real time. While it becomes automatic with practice, it consumes attentional resources and cognitive load. The mind works like a constant radar, evaluating whether we are being appropriate, clear, friendly, or understanding. The second process is cognitive empathy, the ability to infer what the other person thinks, feels, or expects. Unlike emotional empathy, cognitive empathy involves a deliberate effort to model the other person's mind. What might they be interpreting? How might they react if I say this? What do they need right now? This mental work can be extremely exhausting, especially with strangers, in tense contexts, or in groups where hierarchy exists. The mind conducts multiple internal simulations that take up space from deeper or more creative thinking. The third component is constant situational analysis. Every social interaction involves evaluating implicit norms: what is appropriate to say, what is best to remain silent about, when to intervene, when to withdraw, and what role to fulfill. We also analyze social risks, such as being misunderstood, becoming exposed, or making others uncomfortable, and opportunities to generate connection and communicate ideas. This analysis never stops while there is interaction. It operates as a background process that continuously consumes mental bandwidth. When these three mechanisms work together, the mind becomes partially hijacked by the social task. Although the interaction may be enjoyable, the energy expenditure is real and cumulative. This is why many people feel relief when they are alone. The cognitive system stops being divided between simultaneous tasks and regains resources for introspection, concentration, or simply rest. Solitude, then, not only frees up time, but also cognitive energy. This is fundamental, as cognitive energy is the resource that supports mental processes related to attention, working memory, problem-solving, and reasoning. It works like a limited fuel that allows one to maintain focus, analyze information, and sustain complex ideas. When the mind faces tasks that require concentration, this energy is consumed. In social interaction, part of the cognitive energy is allocated to monitoring the context, organizing one's speech, and anticipating others' reactions. Every interruption, every emotional nuance, and every topic change forces the mind to readjust its thinking, which increases the expenditure. Emotional energy, on the other hand, sustains the ability to regulate affective states, process one's own emotions, and absorb others' emotions. It is also a limited resource. When interacting with others, there is a continuous emotional exchange, interpreting gestures, empathizing with concerns, responding to frustrations, containing tensions, or accompanying intense states. The emotional regulation necessary to maintain stability in these exchanges involves a constant consumption of emotional energy. Even enjoyable interactions can be demanding if they require a lot of emotional tuning or sustained empathy. Both forms of energy are consumed simultaneously during social interaction. While the mind processes verbal and nonverbal information, the cognitive expenditure, the affective system adjusts internal reactions to maintain emotional coherence, the emotional expenditure. In demanding environments, such as large meetings or conversations with high symbolic load, The drain occurs at an accelerated pace. The person must quickly evaluate information, control impulses, maintain courtesy, manage tensions, and adapt to changing dynamics. This dual consumption explains why, after an intense social period, many people feel both mental and emotional fatigue at the same time, as if they had been holding two parallel tasks, thinking and feeling, at a level of demand that solitude does not require. For Schopenhauer, the mind is the only truly personal territory of the individual, the most valuable tool because it determines the quality of all experience. His philosophy starts from the idea that much of human suffering arises from contact with the will, that irrational force that manifests in desires, social pressures, and endless chains of needs. Protecting the mind, then, means shielding it from influences that distort judgment and enslave the individual to foreign or collective impulses. Schopenhauer saw excessive social interaction as a risk to inner clarity. He believed that the noise of the world, others' expectations, and the tendency to constant comparison erode the autonomy of thought. The mind, to remain lucid, needs prolonged moments of stillness, contemplation, and distance. It is not about despising others, but about preventing the collective will from invading the space where one's own ideas are developed. In this way, the individual must cultivate and defend their inner life because it is there that their freedom resides. A mind that is not protected becomes vulnerable to distraction, imitation, and emotional dependence. Schopenhauer insisted that only those who preserve their intellectual independence can hold an honest view of the world and of themselves, even when that independence means choosing solitude as a means of preserving the most valuable instrument they possess, their thought. In fact, we can see this in Schopenhauer's own life, as he organized his daily routine with almost ascetic precision to protect his mental energy and avoid any interference that could scatter his attention. His solitary walks were an essential part of this method. He walked every day at the same time, usually along quiet routes, because he believed that the rhythmic movement of the body facilitated clarity of thought. The walk was not leisure. It was an extension of his philosophical work. There, he developed ideas, resolved conceptual doubts, and observed the world attentively without having to interact with it. This physical and emotional distance allowed him to oxygenate his thinking and avoid the cognitive exhaustion caused by social mingling. Another fundamental routine was his isolated meals. Schopenhauer detested trivial conversation, especially during meals, because he felt it fragmented the concentration achieved during study hours. Eating alone allowed him to maintain mental continuity without having to divert energy toward emotional monitoring or social courtesy. In his view, digestion requires calm, and so does the mind. Mixing it with unnecessary chatter was a double drain. For him, silence was a nutritional resource for both the body and the intellect. The third pillar was his strict schedule of uninterrupted thinking. Schopenhauer structured his day into blocks dedicated exclusively to reading, writing, or reflecting. He avoided visits, rejected commitments, and maintained an almost monastic rhythm. He believed that philosophical depth does not arise from scattered moments, but from long hours of internal continuity. Even small interruptions like noise, conversations, and daily tasks scattered what he called the temperature of thought, that dense concentration that allows one to explore an idea to its root. For this reason, his social life was minimal, and his routines were designed so that the will of others would not intrude upon his mental space. A deep analysis of Schopenhauer's routine allows us to deduce that intelligent people do not prioritize quantity, but rather the quality of the cognitive and emotional impact that each activity brings. This selection is not elitist or cold. It responds to the need to protect a limited resource like attention and to preserve the inner clarity that sustains their thinking. Therefore, his relationships, projects, and routines follow a different criterion than that of the majority. First, they seek relationships of high intellectual value. It is not about surrounding oneself with experts or academics, but with people who have mental depth, curious, reflective individuals capable of holding a conversation that broadens perspectives. Intelligence here manifests in the choice. They prefer connections where they can exchange ideas without censorship, explore doubts, discuss honestly, and grow together. They avoid relationships based solely on entertainment, drama, or superficial validation, because they know that these dynamics consume energy without contributing to growth. They value authenticity and the ability to think together. Secondly, they prioritize creative projects, whether professional or personal. A creative project does not necessarily mean art. It can be research, writing, entrepreneurship, conceptual analysis, design, or any task that requires imagination and structure. Intelligent people understand that their development depends on engaging in processes that require innovation, reflection, and consistency. Creativity serves as cognitive reinforcement. It forces the integration of knowledge, sustaining prolonged lines of thought, and facing complex problems. For this reason, they choose projects that produce expansion, not mere occupation. The third axis is activities that increase cognitive depth. This includes demanding reading, self-directed study, contemplation, reflective writing, quiet research, and any practice that refines the ability to concentrate. These activities do not generate instant gratification, but they build a more robust and flexible mind. The intelligent person prioritizes what enhances their long-term mental stability over quick stimuli. They know that depth is not improvised, it is trained. These priorities reveal a constant pattern. Intelligent people orient their lives toward environments where the mind can grow, not just be entertained. Becoming aware of our superficial behavior patterns is becoming an increasingly fundamental task, as modern distraction is not an accident. It is the result of an environment designed to fragment attention. Multitasking, constant noise, and sensory overload form an ecosystem in which deep thinking becomes exceptional, almost countercultural. The promise that doing several things at once increases productivity is one of the most widespread illusions. In reality, multitasking does not exist in the strict sense. What we do is switch tasks rapidly, and each switch comes with a cognitive cost. The mind must reorient its focus, recover the previous thread, and reorganize the information. This process consumes energy, reduces accuracy, and deteriorates working memory. The result is a sense of efficiency accompanied by a real loss in mental quality. Noise, both literal and symbolic, intensifies the dispersion. We live surrounded by conversations, notifications, incidental music, advertisements, digital and environmental interruptions. Each of these stimuli activates automatic mechanisms of attention orientation, forcing the mind to divide itself endlessly. Noise not only interrupts, it prevents attention from achieving a state of continuity, which is essential for complex thinking. The brain can get used to the volume, but not to the where. Excessive stimuli are the third piece of the problem. Technological platforms are designed to capture attention through constant novelty, intense colors, quick rewards, and cycles of social validation. This architecture exploits evolutionary vulnerabilities. We seek what is new, emotional, and socially significant. The excess of stimuli generates a reactive cognitive style, not a reflective one. The mind adapts to processing brief fragments and obtaining immediate gratification, losing the ability to tolerate silence, slowness, or complexity. This weakens cognitive depth because it fragments time and attention, the two fundamental ingredients for any form of serious thinking. A mind interrupted every 2 minutes cannot consolidate ideas, incubate intuitions, or sustain lines of reasoning.